welcome to the program. Claire Gastanaga is my guest. She is the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Virginia. You can find them online at ACLUVA.org. Claire, thank you for being here.
Oh, it's great to see you.
Always look forward to talking to you, and I have a
too.
million questions as always. Let's start with what's been in the headlines.
Okay, let's
Governor
do that.
McAuliffe came out and said, I'm going to restore the rights of former felons. These are people who have been convicted, they served their time, they're out in the community, they're contributing to society, and he said, and many people in Virginia agree with him, there's no reason they shouldn't be able to be heard as voters in this representative government. Let them vote.
Yep.
There was pushback from conservatives, the courts weighed in. What's the latest?
Well, let me start at the very beginning, which is to say the American Civil Liberties Union believes that everybody deserves to be able to vote, and it's a fundamental right for everyone, and we would like to see no one deprived of their right to vote. We have been urging governors in Virginia for more than a decade to do what Governor McAuliffe did in April. We believed firmly that he was on solid legal ground. We had, some fancy law firms in Washington confirm that, in addition to our own experts. And we were so excited when he went forward and did what we had asked 3 governors before him to do, but they had declined. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, in an opinion that, we can talk about what the definition of activist judge is, but in an opinion that was 4-3, decided that what the governor did was a violation of the Constitution. I personally don't think it was the right decision. I personally don't think the people who brought that case had standing, but it is what it is. It's the Virginia Supreme Court. It's not appealable. It's done. Okay. So he had restored by executive order the rights of 206,000 people, as you mentioned, who completed their terms, were back in the community, many of them who'd been back in the community working and living and raising families for decades, literally.
Right.
And there are 206,000 of the 450,000 people who've been disenfranchised by our felon disenfranchisement rule. So there are still more people who are disenfranchised. And he restored them in a single executive order. And now that that's been set aside, about 13,000 people had gone ahead and registered to vote after the restoration. And those registrations have had to have been revoked. Everybody's getting a letter saying that their registration is no longer valid, and they're going to have to re-register at a point in time after they get an individual letter from the governor saying their rights have been restored.
So explain that response of the governor's office to the court's decision.
Well, the governor has said he is going to make sure that all of the people covered by his executive order get a letter from him saying that their rights have been restored. In other words, he's going to go through and do it individually, person by person.
And that would be legal, we assume. Would that be constitutional according to the court?
Well, the folks in the court who argued against his prior action said it wasn't about what he did, but how he did it. So one assumes that if he does it the way they wanted him to, which is one at a time, that will be fine.
Which is how governors have always done it, right?
They have always done it, but they have not done it this governor, even before this order, had restored rights to many, many more Virginians than any governor before him. Kane did more than Warner, McDonnell did more than Kane, McAuliffe did more than McDonnell.
Right,
we were working in the right direction, but Terry McAuliffe recognized that on a one-by-one basis, it takes a long time to do 200,000 people who are currently eligible, plus stay current with the people who become eligible, if you agree.
Sure.
They should be eligible after their time has been
elapsed. But he's doing this.
That's what he says he's doing.
Yeah.
He's not doing it quite as fast as he initially said he would. I think because he wants to be sure that there aren't additional procedural issues people can raise about the substance of what he's doing.
Or that he's restoring the rights of somebody who's still in jail, which conservatives have pointed out, hey, there's
But the reality is he didn't do that because the order only applied to people who met certain conditions. So whether the wrong name was on the list or not, they didn't have their rights restored because they didn't meet the conditions. So
we weren't told that in those press releases.
Of course not. I mean, so we're kind of in a difficult posture right now where the governor is, and the governor's people are being careful. They are going systematically through the 13,000 who already have registered to vote to make sure they get both their restoration of rights letter and they get in line to re-register as soon as possible. And then he promises he's going to work through the other 200,000.
And this is all encouraging news. let me return to your original statement and pull the camera back.
Sure.
And you know me. It makes no sense to me that we would empower a government to be able to separate a citizen, a human being, from their ability, from their right, from their birthright, to be represented in their government by a vote. It's a foundational principle of a constitutional democracy.
And one would think so. But you know, we women had to fight really hard for that right. We didn't get it till 1920, after we had granted rights to people of color. And Virginia's been particularly slow to agree with you that everybody should have the right to participate in our democracy. If you go back to the inception of the felony disenfranchisement rule,
it's a Jim Crow law, isn't it?
Well, we put it on the books in the 1800s in the middle of Reconstruction. We were in a situation then when a lot of people of color were beginning to participate actively. My understanding of history is that at that point in time, let's remember that felonies back then were like murder and mayhem and violent crimes. And
Not stealing expensive tennis shoes.
Or stealing expensive tennis shoes or a $5 chicken, you know, which is one of my favorite felonies. Right. Yeah. We felonized a lot of things since then. So that's one thing. And two, my understanding is during Reconstruction, people specifically went out and tried to get African Americans on crimes that would be disqualifying to try to undercut their political participation. That wasn't working so well. So in 1902, in like 1900 to 1905, every southern state went through a period where they attached higher bars to voting, to specifically for the purpose of disenfranchising all the people of color, all the black people who had registered and begun to participate post-Reconstruction.
And 1902, viewers should know, is the year of the new Virginia Constitution.
Correct.
Virginia adopted what historians refer to as the Jim Crow Constitution of Virginia.
And at that point, there were over 130,000 black people registered to vote. And by the time the 1902 Constitution kicked in, with the enhanced felon disenfranchised, with the poll tax, with the literacy test, with all that stuff, we were down to less than 20,000 in a very short period of time. And that was the purpose. I mean, Carter Glass is on the record as saying that those things were about getting black people off the voting rolls.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is when I was doing some research, I found a 1940s commission that was looking at getting rid of the literacy test and all that stuff. And one of the footnotes they dropped was that part of the reason why Virginia's legislature did not ratify the women's right to vote until 1952 was they didn't want to empower, quote, Negro women to vote. And I think there was this sense that somehow giving women acknowledging that women should have the right to vote would bring more black women into the process. So if we just don't let women do it either,
which white Virginia didn't want to see.
Right, and they didn't care.
So here we are. So the governor's right then in the 21st century to say that this thing that's on the books that removes the right to vote of felons is an old racist law that's still in the books, and we should be ashamed and we should get rid of it.
Right, and you know it's unfortunate that it persisted when we rewrote the Constitution in 1970. As you and I know, one good thing in the 1970 Constitution is we ended up with a right to education for all children, which didn't exist beforehand, which is how they closed the schools during massive resistance. And so to avoid that, we now have a right to a quality education in Virginia. But the bad thing was that nobody went, oh, maybe we should get rid of this too, or reform it, or give the General Assembly more authority to change it, or something. So we do have this Constitution that has this remnant.
The South was experiencing that backlash of the civil rights movement and the student movement and the second wave of feminism and all of these movements that were creating progressive gains, moving America closer to its ideals, and yet white conservative America was pushing back against that.
Right, and so I mean it's not surprising it didn't change, but it is sad that we had that opportunity and we missed it.
So Claire, let me change gears here, and I want to ask you about Baltimore.
Right.
Baltimore, Maryland, which of course has been in the headlines.
Can I go back to voting for just 1 second?
Yes, you can.
Okay. We all need to make sure that we work really hard to make sure that everybody knows that they have to register to vote a month before the election. they want to participate in the federal elections this year. They do need to register to vote.
At least a month ahead.
Before the first week in October, basically.
Okay.
And that's why we're all feeling some intense pressure about restoring the rights of these people and making sure that the people who've already registered can get re-registered, because there is a deadline looming and we all have to work really hard. But no one who's a Virginian who cares about the future of Virginia and the future of their children should not be active and participating in the election process. And
agreed.
So it's an important franchise that we all have to respect.
Absolutely.
And use. Yeah.
And a birthright.
And a birthright, I would say.
I want to ask you about Baltimore,
yeah.
but let's do this. Let's take a very quick break. When we come back, Baltimore, Freddie Gray, the militarization of law enforcement, body cameras, all sorts of stuff with Claire Gastanaga of the ACLU of Virginia. I'm Coy Barefoot. You're watching the Coy Barefoot Program. We'll take a quick break and be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with Claire Gastanaga of the Virginia ACLU, Baltimore, Maryland, Freddie Gray, all of the police officers that were involved in his murder, in my opinion, were acquitted. The judge said it was not a jury trial. The judge said there's not enough here to convict them. And then millions of people in the nation went, what? Wait a minute, what? So what's the ACLU's reaction to this whole story? I mean, there's so much here.
Well, I think let's focus for today on the report that the Department of Justice just put out after a year of investigating the department that found, systemic racial bias in the way that, and sexism in the way the department and the whole law enforcement community operated. I mean,
in Baltimore.
In Baltimore. I mean, there's a really unfortunate set of quotes about a rape victim that came out of a prosecutor and a police officer that are in this report. So, there's something to be said for, bigotry begets bigotry. I mean, and if you read through that report, it's kind of like the after-action report in Ferguson that the Department of Justice did, where they found a similar pattern of systemic bias. And one of the law enforcement people I talk to often here in Virginia said to me he thought that Ferguson report was like an indictment that you would get in a civil racketeering case for engaging in a corrupt practice to remove people of their civil rights in order to get money, because in that case they were ticketing people and taking the money and using it for their budget. And so Baltimore, I haven't had a chance to really parse through the report completely, but
it's damning.
The Department
Absolutely
of Justice
damning.
basically says, it's systemic. And to their credit, the Baltimore officials today said that they were ready to enter into an agreement enforceable in federal court to remedy the situations that they've found there. But I think it's a wake-up call.
Which is the equivalent of a police department throwing itself on the mercy of the court?
Well, it's the equivalent of volunteering to have an outside agency supervise you because you want to be sure that people have confidence that you're going to fix the problem, and that when you say it's fixed, it actually is fixed.
Yeah.
So
what is the takeaway of the report? The Baltimore police were systemically operating in a racist fashion, targeting people of color.
Right, and it makes more credit. When the prosecutor announced that she was going to withdraw the charges against the remaining officers that they had been trying to prosecute for criminal acts, and she said, I can't in good faith go forward with these other cases because the investigation by the department of the facts was so poor and so obviously affected by bias that I don't have the evidence I should have. I can't reasonably as a prosecutor make this case go
and
forward.
prosecutors don't go out and get their own evidence.
No.
The police department is supposed to do that research for them.
So it makes that statement of hers much more credible than people were willing to assign credibility to her when she first said it, I think. And I think everybody in law enforcement needs to wake up and understand that, look, there are mostly good people in law enforcement.
Agreed.
Good people in law enforcement trying to do their job to keep us safe.
They're there for all the right reasons.
All the right reasons and doing a good job. And they should be as aggressively interested in getting rid of the bad apples as anybody. And
not be part of the cover-up
Right.
and the opaque circling of the wagons.
And one of the problems we have in Virginia is, as a lawyer, if I do something that's unethical, right? I commit a certain kind of malpractice. I take my client's money. I defraud them in some way. I don't communicate. I can lose my license. I mean, there are all kinds of things I can lose my license for.
And all the lawyers in Virginia don't cover for you.
Right.
And say, brother, sister, we got your back. Don't worry about it. We're not going to let them take you.
But here's what's different. In Virginia, you have to have a certification from the state to be a police officer. You can only lose that certification if you're convicted of a felony or certain misdemeanors, like involving domestic violence or sexual assault. If you violate the use of force policy of your department 5 ways, if you engage in purposeful discrimination or sexual harassment, you can get fired, but you can walk right down the street and get hired by another agency the next day because you can't lose your license to police. And the last time the General Assembly looked at that issue in 2012,
doesn't make any sense.
They wouldn't go beyond adding a few misdemeanor convictions to the list of things that could disqualify you. They could not get support for saying misconduct that is not criminal could disqualify you from being an officer. And that's a huge issue in terms of professionalization of the police, in terms of the public confidence. So, I mean, that's one issue that I think people need to be looking at. We're also very concerned about, and we did a report on body cam policies called Getting to Win-Win a year ago now. And we're very concerned that Virginians experience police use of body cams in the same way in some circumstances. Like, we should know when we're being filmed. We should be able to see the films of ourselves.
There should be state
guidelines that apply to everybody.
Of course, And there's not, right?
There's not, and the Department of Criminal Justice Services did a set of model guidelines, which we criticized quite directly, sent a copy of our criticism. We're told in public that the model guidelines were a work in progress and there might be additional changes. None have been made. The original model guidelines were developed only with law enforcement's participation. And we're working with a number of agencies around the state, and one experience that's been really positive for us is Sheriff Balderson in Westmoreland County, who now has implemented both a body cams policy and a use of force policy that meet every standard that we believe should apply.
Wow. That's the only one in Virginia.
He is very focused on transparency and accountability. He's agreed that everybody should have a right to see a video of themselves. He's put a record retention policy in place that we think is quite favorable, both to his department and to the public. And on the use of force policy, I think it's probably one of the more, if not the most progressive, one of the more progressive policies in place in the United States that wasn't forced on a department by a court.
So then what's so hard about this? I mean, if you look at Westmoreland County,
he's got 15 officers, he covers 250
you look at
square
every other
miles.
police department and sheriff's department, the state police in Virginia, and say,
now,
what's so hard about that?
I'm really excited because
this is good for police. That's what they don't get. This is good for policing.
Yeah, I'm really excited because, I mean, the Attorney General's gone around the state 3 years in a row and done these listening tours where he's talked only to law enforcement. And this year, for the first year, he's starting to pull people from the community in the conversation. The Secretary of Public Safety has set up 4 public listening sessions, he's calling them, for law enforcement and their community partners. to come and talk about issues related to policing. One's going to be in Roanoke, September 27th. And then there's one in Richmond next week, and then the last week in August they're in Northern Virginia and Virginia Beach, and you can register to participate online at the Department of Criminal Justice Services website. But
and that's a bit of a first, isn't it? They usually don't do that kind of thing.
I know, and I really hope that people who are concerned about how they're being policed will be there to talk about, things like, should my law enforcement office be able to buy a tank without going through a process that involves public participation?
Right.
We think not. Should the public have a right to know who the officers were who were involved in a critical incident? The Roanoke County Police Department has said they will never release the names of the people that were involved in the shooting of Keontae Spencer. I mean, that's just wrong. I mean, the best practice is no more than 48 hours. Once you've made sure that the officer and his family or her family is safe, then you release their names to the public. So, those are issues that I hope people are going to speak out about.
What does it say, Claire, about policing in America? What does it say about America that here in the 21st century, we're still struggling for this kind of transparency, we're still struggling for this kind of justice, to have law enforcement embrace what we know are best practices? They still reject them. They still get, politicians still run cover for them. Well, and yet experts look at it and say, here's the best way to do this that's good for everybody, even you, and you're doing this.
And so, unfortunately, do the courts. I mean, if you look at the Fourth Amendment decision that came down toward the end of the term, where the police did everything wrong, they engaged in an illegal stop and illegal arrest, and they still were able to use the evidence, then
why do we have a Fourth
why
Amendment?
do we have a Fourth Amendment? Yeah. And that's why I think, we've become very focused on state law and saying to the prosecutors who say to us routinely when we're talking about things like the warrant requirement for drone use, the warrant requirement for historical cell phone, records, when they say to me, which they often do, but Claire, you're asking for things that go beyond what the Fourth Amendment requires. My answer is, yeah. That's the policy choice we're asking the legislature to make, because the floor that the Fourth Amendment provides now has gotten to be subterranean.
Yeah.
It is. It is. It's subterranean.
And the courts have pushed it so far down into a well.
And you add to that what is called qualified immunity, which is you can't hold an officer responsible for violating somebody's constitutional rights unless there's an explicit sentence in some court case that says the exact facts of what he did were unconstitutional. Then he gets qualified immunity because he didn't know that it was wrong. The courts have really hurt us in that respect as well. So it's not just politicians.
It's almost got, I don't want to be hyperbolic, but it's almost gotten to the point where it's like a third world dictator's security forces who are immune from any oversight. Yeah. They're immune from being prosecuted. And I know that might be a stretch, but at times when I read some of these stories, it's what it seems like to me.
I think the community is responsible for this as anybody. I mean, I think we have to accept some responsibility. Look, we're in a situation in which we say consistently as taxpayers we don't want to pay the price to have a professional, well-paid police force. And then we send them out to go earn the revenues to pay themselves by citing people. And so who do they cite? They don't cite the people with political power in the community.
No.
They
go after marginalized communities of people of color and the poor.
Because that's the easy money.
Yeah.
And and I don't mean to say this in a way that is, I don't mean to assign any intent. It's just the way the market works, You're
going to get what you pay for. And if we're not paying them like we should be paying them more money to do the job, the very difficult job that they're each required to do, this is what you're going to get.
And if we accept the idea that we're going to have a fee-based criminal justice system. So, for example, I recently got a ticket for an expired inspection sticker. Okay, my mechanic, I did get it inspected. I paid for a new tire, but my mechanic didn't put the sticker on my car.
Didn't.
Forgot.
Yeah.
So I get a ticket. The ticket's $30. That makes sense to me, right? $50 for the local court costs, and another $10 for a quote local fee, because they wrote it under the local parallel ordinance so they could get a little cash into their local coffers. Now, That's not the way the system ought to work, you know? I mean, I have no problem, you know, and I know most people have no problem paying, you know, a fine for having done something, you know, and
Sure.
whatever. But what we've done is we've said we're not going to pay taxes to fund the courts and the police departments. We're going to make the people that violate the law do it, but not enough of us violate the law. So then you have to go out and find some people, you know, to get them to violate the law. I mean,
Which is exactly what was going on in Ferguson.
That's what was going on in Ferguson. And frankly, we've got localities in Virginia where 9% of their revenue is coming from fines and forfeitures. It's a revenue stream. And as long as we...
Going out and taking things from
right,
people.
and as long as that's the tone we set and the expectation we send, then, you know, a lot of what you're talking about needs to be visited, you know, come to my front door and knock on the door and say, how come you're doing this? It's not, you know, it's not law enforcement that's writing that ticket that way.
So what can, we've only got a couple of minutes
Right.
left, but what can viewers do who are watching these incessant stories about the interactions between law enforcement all around the country? It seems every week there's some horrific tragedy.
Right.
And what can we do?
Well, the first
can we
thing
do?
they should do is go to their elected officials and say, you know what? Civilians ought to have a role in this process. You know, it shouldn't just be that the military or the paramilitary or law enforcement gets to decide the rules of engagement, the policy on use of force, whether the department's going to use tasers or not, you know, all those things. Those are policy questions that the elected officials ought to take on themselves. They can't direct the day-to-day and shouldn't, but they can say, we want to review and sign off
They
on
can
the
set
use
the
of force
parameters
policy.
and the guidelines
Right.
as the voice
Right.
of the people.
And the people need to demand that of their elected officials. And they also need to start talking about the fee-based justice system and the impact it has.
Claire, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for all the work you do and your amazing team.
Oh, thanks.
The website is acluva.org. Claire Gastanaga, the Executive Director, the ACLU of Virginia. We'll definitely talk again. I'm Coy Barefoot. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.